It was late spring when my stepmom and I decided to go camping in honor of my dad, who had passed away the year before. He had always loved the outdoors, and it felt like the right way to keep his memory alive. My stepmom, Sarah, wasn't much of a camper, but she insisted we go. She said it was important to her, and I couldn't argue with that. I wasn't much older than 22, and Sarah was in her early 40s. We were close, but this trip felt like an attempt to heal some unspoken gap left after his death. We chose a remote camping spot deep in the forests of northern Maine. It was a place Dad had taken me when I was younger, a quiet area near a small lake. I remembered the trail was long but manageable, with views that made the effort worth it. The drive took us about 6 hours from the small town where we lived, and by the time we arrived at the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't a popular campground with amenities. It was more of a backcountry area for experienced hikers and campers. Sarah and I loaded up our gear, double-checked our supplies, and started the hike. I carried most of the heavy stuff since she wasn't used to trekking with a full pack. The trail was harder than I remembered. The forest had grown thicker over the years, and parts of the path were barely visible under layers of fallen leaves and branches. The air smelled earthy and damp, and the sounds of the forest surrounded us. Birds calling, leaves rustling, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, but it felt heavy too, like the forest held on to secrets it didn't want to share. We reached the campsite just as the sun started dipping below the trees. The lake shimmered under the fading light, its surface so still it looked like glass. It was exactly as I remembered. A small clearing by the water, surrounded by towering pines. There was a fire pit someone had built years ago, now filled with old ash and charred wood. We set up the tent together, working in silence except for the occasional instruction. By the time we were done, the sky was a deep blue, and the stars were beginning to show. We ate a quick meal of sandwiches and trail mix, too tired to bother with cooking that night. I sat by the edge of the lake, staring at the water, while Sarah stayed near the fire pit, organizing our supplies. The night felt colder than I expected, the kind of cold that gets into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. The forest seemed alive with sounds, twigs snapping, branches creaking, and the occasional splash from the lake. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but there was something about the way the sounds carried that made my skin crawl. We turned in early, both exhausted from the hike. The tent was cramped but warm. Sarah fell asleep quickly, her breathing steady and soft. I lay awake for a while, listening. The forest seemed quieter now, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that felt like waiting. I eventually drifted off, but my sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of my dad, the forest, and something I couldn't quite remember when I woke up. The next morning, we woke to the sound of birds and the sun streaming through the tent fabric. The unease from the night before felt like a bad memory, easily dismissed in the light of day. We spent the morning exploring the area. I showed Sarah the old fishing spot Dad and I used to visit and the fallen tree we used as a makeshift bench. She seemed to enjoy it, even though she wasn't used to being out in the wild. We decided to hike further up the trail after lunch to see if we could find a better view of the lake. The trail was even less maintained than the section we had hiked the day before. At times, it felt like we were bushwhacking more than hiking. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. After about an hour, we reached a small ridge overlooking the lake. The view was incredible. The water sparkled under the sun, and the forest stretched out endlessly in all directions. We stayed there for a while, soaking it in. It felt like a moment of peace, a small victory in our attempt to honor my dad. But as we headed back, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed different. The trail looked unfamiliar, even though we were retracing our steps. trees I didn't remember seeing before, bends in the path that felt out of place. I didn't say anything to Sarah. I didn't want to worry her, but I kept looking around, trying to find something familiar. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the forest was shifting around us. The air grew heavier, and the sounds of the forest seemed distant, muffled. When we finally made it back to the campsite, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed. But that relief was short-lived. That night, the unease returned. Sarah and I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Neither of us spoke much. The silence between us felt thick, like we were both aware of something we didn't want to say. The forest seemed louder now, filled with noises that didn't belong. A distant rustling that didn't sound like wind. A soft thud that made me think of footsteps. We decided to sleep early again, hoping the morning would bring some clarity. But this time, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to Sarah's breathing and the sounds outside the tent. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear looking for food. But the sound didn't stop. It moved around the tent, slow and deliberate. Then came the faintest tap against the fabric. Just once. I froze, holding my breath, my mind racing. The sound stopped, and the forest went quiet again. Not just quiet, silent. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just a deep, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and when Sarah woke the next morning, she looked as tired as I felt. We decided to pack up and leave that morning. Neither of us said it, but we both felt it. Something was wrong. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt more oppressive. The trees seemed closer, the path narrower. At one point, I thought I saw something move in the distance. A shape darting between the trees, too quick to make out. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. When we finally reached the car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We loaded up our gear quickly, eager to put distance between us and the forest. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees, a dark figure watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never talked about what happened that weekend. It was like an unspoken agreement to leave it behind. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that scraping sound and the figure I thought I saw. And I wonder if it was really the forest that felt wrong, or if something had been there with us all along. I work for a small company that specializes in outdoor gear. My general manager, John, is one of those guys who takes the outdoor lifestyle way too seriously. He loves roughing it, hiking for miles, and sleeping under the stars. It's almost his personality. So, when he announced a mandatory business retreat in the middle of a forest, I wasn't thrilled. I didn't hate nature, but camping wasn't my thing. I prefer warm beds and the comforting hum of the city. But John, he said the meeting was going to be about team building, so there wasn't much of a choice. It was the summer of 2022, and the chosen location was a stretch of dense forest in Oregon, far from any town or cell signal. There wasn't even a cabin, just tents, sleeping bags, and a campfire. John was clear, no technology allowed. Disconnect to reconnect, he'd said during a meeting earlier that month. So, early on a Friday morning, I found myself crammed into a van with 5 other employees. Most of them seemed excited, chatting about hiking trails and fishing. I sat quietly, staring out the window, dreading the weekend ahead. The drive took about 4 hours. When we finally pulled off the main road, we were on a narrow dirt path that snaked deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees were massive, towering over us, their branches almost blocking out the sun. It was beautiful, I had to admit, but it also felt isolating. We parked in a clearing and unloaded our gear. John was all smiles, barking instructions as he handed out tents and supplies. He even handed me a survival knife, grinning like we were preparing for some grand adventure. "You'll thank me later," he said. I doubted that. After we set up camp, John gathered us around the fire pit for a meeting. He talked about the company's goals, the importance of teamwork, and some new product launches. It was standard corporate stuff, except we were sitting on logs in the middle of nowhere. I zoned out after a while, focusing instead on the sounds of the forest. The rustling leaves, the chirping birds, the occasional snap of a twig. By the time the meeting ended, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The forest quickly grew dark, and the temperature dropped. We lit a fire and cooked some basic meals, mostly canned food and prepackaged stuff. After dinner, John suggested we split into pairs and explore the surrounding area for a bit. He said it would build trust. I was paired with Mark, a quiet guy from accounting. We grabbed flashlights and set off down a narrow trail. The forest felt different at night. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more menacing. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About half an hour in, we found an old, rusted car partially buried in the undergrowth. It looked like it had been there for decades. The windows were shattered, and the hood was covered in moss. Mark and I stood there for a moment, shining our flashlights over it. It was eerie, but we didn't linger. When we got back to camp, John was nowhere to be found. The others said he'd gone off to scout a spot for tomorrow's activities. I didn't think much of it. John was always wandering off. But then an hour passed. Then two. By midnight, we started to get worried. A couple of us grabbed flashlights and began calling his name, but the forest swallowed our voices. We decided to wait until morning to search further. Maybe he'd gotten lost and found somewhere to bunk down for the night. The next day, we split into groups to search for John. I was with Mark again. We retraced the path he'd taken the night before, calling his name every few minutes. After a couple of hours, we stumbled upon something strange. It was a small campsite, a tent, a burnt-out fire, and a pile of supplies. But it wasn't ours. The tent was old and tattered, the kind you'd see in an army surplus store. There were cans of food scattered around, some of them open and covered in flies. Inside the tent, we found a notebook. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, almost illegible in some parts. What we could read made my stomach churn. It was a diary, and the entries talked about someone watching the writer, following them through the forest. Mark and I looked at each other, the same thought running through our minds. We ran back to camp and told the others. That's when we realized something even worse. Our supplies had been tampered with. Food was missing, tents had been unzipped, and someone had scratched deep gouges into the side of the van. Panic set in. Some of the group wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the van wouldn't start. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. We spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. Without cell service, we couldn't call for help. We decided to stay put for the night and set out on foot in the morning to find the nearest road. That night was the longest of my life. We took turns keeping watch, sitting by the fire with whatever makeshift weapons we could find. I had the survival knife John had given me, gripping it so tightly my hand ached. Around midnight, we heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the camp. We shined our flashlights into the trees but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, but none of us slept after that. At first light, we packed up what we could carry and started walking. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and every so often, we'd hear rustling in the bushes or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of our eyes. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the main road. A passing car stopped, and the driver called for help. When the police arrived, we told them everything. They searched the forest but didn't find John or any trace of the other campsite. The van was towed, and we were taken back to town. I quit the company the next day. Sometimes late at night, I think about that trip, about the footsteps, the scratched van, and the diary. And I wonder if John ever made it out of those woods, or if whoever had been watching us had been waiting for someone like him all along. It was late summer in 2016 when my cousin Mark invited me on a camping trip to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. Mark was an Army officer and worked as a special agent in his downtime. Growing up, he was always the one who could handle tough situations. His job made him even sharper, more prepared, and a little intimidating. I was 28 at the time, and Mark was a couple of years older. We hadn't spent much time together in years, but he called out of the blue and suggested we go camping for a weekend. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but the idea of spending time with Mark sounded good. Felt like a chance to reconnect. I figured if anything went wrong, he'd know what to do. We packed light but efficiently. Mark's influence. He had a way of making you feel underprepared for everything. A sturdy tent, sleeping bags, a cooler with enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and his ever-present duffel bag, which I suspected held more survival gear than he let on. We drove upstate early on a Friday morning, arriving at a trailhead that wasn't marked on most maps. Mark said he'd found it years ago and that it was a great spot to get away from everything. The path was narrow and overgrown, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. We hiked for miles deeper and deeper into the woods. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Mark was quiet as usual, but it didn't bother me. He always seemed to be calculating something, even during simple activities like hiking. By late afternoon, we found a clearing near a small stream. It was perfect, secluded, with enough open space to set up camp but surrounded by dense trees for cover. Mark got to work setting up the tent while I gathered firewood. He moved with precision, every action deliberate, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Night fell quickly in the woods. The fire crackled as we ate and talked about random things. Our jobs, family, life. Mark mentioned he'd recently worked a case involving illegal activities in remote areas like this, but he didn't go into detail. He never did. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The woods were silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets or the hoot of an owl. I fell asleep almost immediately, feeling safe with Mark nearby. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, but then I noticed Mark was sitting up, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the dying fire outside. He was motionless, staring at the tent wall. "What is it?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure if he heard me. He didn't answer, but his hand moved slowly toward his duffel bag. I listened carefully, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. First, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My stomach tightened. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong out here, not at this time of night. Mark unzipped the tent quietly and stepped out. I stayed inside, frozen, listening as he moved around the camp. The crunching grew louder, more deliberate. It was circling us. Mark's footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, suddenly, there was a loud rustling, followed by Mark's voice, low but firm. "It's fine," he said when he came back into the tent. "Probably just an animal." He didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. The next morning, the air felt heavier. Mark didn't mention what had happened, but he seemed more alert. He checked the perimeter of our camp, looking for tracks or signs of activity. He found nothing. We spent the day exploring the area, following the stream and climbing a small ridge that overlooked the forest. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, Mark would stop abruptly and look around, his hand resting near the knife on his belt. That evening, we decided to stay up later, keeping the fire going. Mark said it was to ward off animals, but I suspected he wanted to stay alert for whatever had disturbed us the night before. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again, the crunching of leaves, slow and deliberate. Mark heard it too. This time, he didn't wait. He grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to follow. We stepped out of the tent, and the sound stopped. The firelight barely reached the edge of the trees, and beyond that was darkness. Mark shone his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the night. That's when we saw it, a figure partially hidden behind a tree. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half visible in the beam of light. Mark called out, but there was no response. Slowly, he approached, knife in hand. I stayed close behind, my heart pounding. When we reached the tree, there was no one there. Mark examined the ground, looking for footprints, but there was nothing. It didn't make sense. We both saw it. Someone was there. We returned to the camp, but neither of us slept that night. Mark stayed up, keeping watch while I lay in the tent, trying to make sense of what had happened. The third day started uneventfully. We packed up camp and began the hike back to the car. Mark insisted we stick to the trail, moving quickly but cautiously. About halfway back, we found something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks stacked unnaturally in the middle of the trail. Mark stopped and studied it, his jaw tightening. It was a marker, a warning. Someone had been here. We picked up the pace, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The crunching sounds returned, this time closer, more persistent. Mark pulled out a small handgun from his duffel bag. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. Then, just as the trail came into view, something stepped out from the trees. A man, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. He was dirty, his face partially obscured by a hood. Mark raised the gun, shouting for him to stop. The man didn't move. "Go!" Mark said to me, his voice steady but urgent. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the car, my legs burning with each step. Behind me, I heard a scuffle, then a loud crack, a gunshot. When I reached the car, I turned to see Mark running toward me. His face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the gun. He didn't say a word as we got into the car and drove away. We didn't talk about what happened on the drive home. Mark dropped me off and told me to forget about the trip. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about illegal activity in the Adirondack Mountains. Authorities had discovered a hidden encampment linked to a dangerous group involved in smuggling and other crimes. I never asked Mark if it was related to our trip, but I didn't need to. The look in his eyes that night told me everything I needed to know. Some things are better left unsaid. I planned a one-week trip to explore the vast wilderness of North America with my dog, Rocky. It was early October, the perfect time of year. The summer crowds were gone, the forests were quiet, and the air was crisp without being bitter. I had recently bought a used camper van, and this trip felt like the perfect way to test it out. The plan was simple: drive, find remote spots to camp, and enjoy the freedom of being off the grid. Rocky, a loyal German shepherd, was my only companion. At 4 years old, he was in his prime, full of energy and fiercely protective. I figured having him around would make the trip feel safer, especially in such isolated places. The first day was uneventful. I left Chicago and drove northwest. The landscape changed gradually, from city skylines to rolling plains, and finally to dense forests. By nightfall, I found a spot off a dirt road near a small lake. It was beautiful and eerily quiet. That night, I lit a small campfire and cooked some canned stew while Rocky lay at my feet, ears perked at every rustle. The stars were brilliant, the kind of view you only get far from city lights. Felt perfect. But as I settled into the van to sleep, I couldn't shake a subtle unease. Rocky, usually relaxed at night, kept pacing. His nails clicked against the van's floor, and every so often, he'd growl softly, staring out the window. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to him being in an unfamiliar place. The next morning, I decided to hike a trail near the lake. It was a crisp, cool morning, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. Rocky trotted ahead, tail wagging, occasionally stopping to sniff or investigate a sound. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were fresh, maybe a day old, and heading the same direction as us. That wouldn't have been unusual, except I hadn't seen another person for miles. The tracks were deep, made by heavy boots, and they veered off the trail into the thicker brush. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them for a while. But after about 10 minutes, they stopped abruptly in the middle of nowhere. No signs of a campfire, no trail leading further, just nothing. That unease from the night before returned. I headed back to the van, deciding it was better not to linger. I drove further west, deeper into the wilderness. My goal was to reach a national forest known for its remote beauty. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot far from the main road. It was perfect, completely secluded, surrounded by towering trees. But as I explored the area, I stumbled across something unsettling. About 50 yards from my van, there was an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, but there were signs someone had been there recently. An empty backpack, a few cans of food, and a single hiking boot. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave their gear behind? The area didn't feel right. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Even Rocky seemed on edge, sticking close to me instead of wandering like he usually did. I decided to move the van closer to the main road. By now, the trip didn't feel as relaxing as I'd hoped. The solitude I usually craved felt oppressive. Still, I told myself I was overthinking things. That evening, I parked at another secluded spot, this time near a river. As the sun set, I threw a stick for Rocky and tried to enjoy the peace. But when I walked back to the van, I noticed something chilling. On the ground, near the driver's side door, was a fresh boot print. It wasn't mine. I scanned the area, my heart pounding. There was no one in sight. No sounds except the river and the occasional rustle of leaves. Rocky growled low, his hackles up. I grabbed the hatchet I kept in the van and stayed up most of the night, listening for any sounds of movement. But nothing happened. I was ready to cut the trip short. The joy of being in nature had been replaced by paranoia. But I told myself to push through. I had 2 days left. That day, I drove further into the forest, away from any towns or main roads. The spot I found was beautiful, with a view of a mountain ridge in the distance. But as the sun dipped lower, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. Rocky wouldn't settle, pacing around the van and barking at nothing. Just as I was about to climb into the van for the night, I saw it. A figure in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were definitely watching me. I shouted, hoping to scare them off, but they didn't move. They just stood there, motionless. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I was exhausted and ready to leave. I packed up quickly and started driving toward the nearest town. But as I turned onto the dirt road leading back to the highway, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A second set of tire tracks, fresh and heading the same direction I was. Someone had been here recently, maybe even last night. I sped up, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. About an hour later, I noticed a vehicle behind me. It was a dark truck, following at a distance. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but no matter how many turns I made, it stayed there. Panic set in. I pushed the van as fast as it would go, but it was no match for the truck. The driver didn't try to overtake me. They just followed, always keeping the same distance. Eventually, I spotted a small gas station. I pulled in, hoping the presence of other people would deter whoever was in the truck. But when I looked back, the truck was gone. I spent the last night of the trip at a well-lit campground near a small town. There were other campers around, and for the first time in days, I felt somewhat safe. But as I lay in the van, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Around midnight, Rocky started growling again. I peered out the window and saw nothing. But then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the van. I grabbed my hatchet and threw open the door, shouting into the darkness. But whoever it was had already disappeared into the night. By dawn, I was packed and on the road, heading home. It's been weeks since that trip, and I can't stop thinking about it. I never figured out who was following me or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear footsteps outside my window, and Rocky, my loyal protector, just sits by the door, staring at it, his ears twitching at every sound. I'm not one for camping unless it's part of the job, but that's exactly what I had to do back in 2012 when I was hired to watch over an old construction site out in the hills of Oregon. I was 38 years old, a former security guard for a mall, but after a string of budget cuts, I found myself taking whatever work came my way. That's how I ended up here, sitting alone in a makeshift camp with rain pouring down around me. The site was abandoned during the recession, leaving behind half-built cabins, tools rusting in the elements, and stacks of lumber slowly rotting. It was remote, about 20 miles from the nearest town, and the company wanted to prevent theft of what little equipment remained. I wasn't too thrilled about staying there overnight, but the paycheck was decent, and I figured it'd be easy work. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was already gray, heavy with the promise of rain. My campsite was a small clearing near one of the unfinished cabins. I had a pop-up tent, a foldable chair, and a small propane stove to keep me company. My flashlight and a handheld radio were my lifelines. Cell service was non-existent, so the radio was the only way to contact anyone if something went wrong. By the time I set up camp, the rain had started as a light drizzle, turning the dirt paths into slick mud. The site was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabins were spread out across a few acres, each in various stages of construction. Some had walls and roofs. Others were little more than wooden frames. I spent the first hour walking the perimeter, making sure everything was in order. The place looked untouched, like no one had been here in years. Rusted nails jutted out from planks, and weeds grew tall around the foundations. I noted a few spots where animals had made burrows, but there was no sign of people. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the rain picked up. I retreated to my tent and turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off the wet surfaces outside. I made a quick meal of instant noodles and sat there, listening to the rain drum against the fabric above me. Hours passed slowly. I kept checking my watch, counting down the minutes until dawn. Around midnight, I heard something strange. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but it sounded like movement, wet footsteps squelching in the mud. I froze, gripping my flashlight tightly. The sound came from the direction of the nearest cabin, about 50 yards away. I strained my ears, but the rain made it hard to tell if it was an animal or something else. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I felt uneasy. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold rain. My flashlight's beam wavered as I scanned the area. The cabin loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible. I stood there for a while, listening. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by the relentless patter of rain. I was about to head back to the tent when I noticed something odd near the cabin. A faint light flickered inside, like a dying flashlight or maybe a phone screen. That didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be here. My job was to ensure that. I approached cautiously, my boots sinking into the mud with every step. The light grew brighter as I got closer, illuminating the interior of the cabin through the unfinished walls. When I reached the edge of the structure, I hesitated. The light was coming from a corner of the room, but there was no sound, no movement. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. My flashlight revealed a pile of tools and debris in the corner, but no light source. The moment I realized the light was gone, a loud crash echoed from behind me. I spun around, heart racing, and saw that a pile of lumber had toppled over near the entrance. The wind must have knocked it down, I thought, but it didn't explain the light. I decided to do another sweep of the site just to be safe. I walked to each cabin, my flashlight sweeping over the dark interiors. Everything was as I had left it earlier, empty and abandoned. By the time I returned to my tent, I was drenched and shivering. I sat inside, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The rain had a way of amplifying every little sound, turning normal creaks and groans into something sinister. But then I saw it again. This time, the light was outside, moving between the trees at the edge of the site. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was dimmer, almost like the glow of a lantern. It weaved through the woods, disappearing and reappearing as it moved further away. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there. I grabbed my radio and called the main office, but all I got was static. Cursing under my breath, I decided to follow the light. The forest was dense, the ground slick with rain and fallen leaves. The light moved ahead of me, always just out of reach. I stumbled over roots and ducked under branches, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to weaken. Eventually, the light stopped near a small clearing. I approached slowly, my boots squelching in the mud. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a campsite, but not mine. A torn tent lay in the center, surrounded by scattered belongings. Clothes, a backpack, and what looked like a broken lantern. The ground was disturbed, as if there had been a struggle. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. The rain had washed away any tracks, leaving only the eerie scene before me. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to get out of there and call the authorities, but my radio was useless, and the nearest road was miles away. As I turned to head back, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer, coming from the direction of my campsite. Panic set in as I realized whoever had been here might have doubled back. I ran as fast as I could, slipping and sliding in the mud. When I reached my tent, I found it slashed open, the contents scattered and soaked. My flashlight batteries finally gave out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I felt a presence. Someone standing just a few feet away. I froze, holding my breath as the rain poured down around me. When I finally turned the flashlight on, there was no one there. But on the ground, near the torn fabric of my tent, was a knife. It wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the site was eerily quiet. I packed up what little I had left and walked to the nearest road. When I reported what had happened, the police investigated but found nothing. The other campsite was gone, as if it had never been there. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. All I know is that I've never gone camping again, and I never will. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 25. After years of city living, I felt like I needed a break. My job was suffocating, and the idea of escaping into nature seemed perfect. I'd done some camping with my dad as a kid, so I figured I could handle a weekend alone. I chose Quiet Pines Campground, a remote area about 50 miles outside the small town of Ashford. It was far enough from civilization to feel isolated, but close enough to make me believe I was still in control. I packed the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and enough food and water for 2 days. I also brought a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a basic hunting knife, just in case. It was a warm Friday morning when I left. The drive to the campground took about 3 hours, winding through dense forests that seemed to get darker and quieter the farther I went. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty except for one rusted pickup truck. I didn't think much of it. It was early, and the place was big enough that I figured I wouldn't run into anyone. I grabbed my gear and started hiking into the woods, following a narrow trail marked by faded signs. The trail was overgrown in some places, with roots and branches reaching out like they were trying to trip me. After about an hour, I found a small clearing near a stream. It felt perfect, secluded but not too far from the trail. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a small fire later. The sound of the stream was soothing, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. As the sun began to set, the forest transformed. The cheerful chirping of birds gave way to the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I lit my fire, cooked a simple meal of canned beans and sausage, and sat there staring into the flames. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. I stayed up until the fire burned low, then crawled into my tent. The forest was silent except for the soft babble of the stream. I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe in my little corner of the world. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the trees and the sound of running water. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for about a mile, taking in the beauty of the forest. The air was crisp, and the ground was soft under my boots. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The forest had grown eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own footsteps. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off as my imagination and kept walking, but the feeling lingered. That's when I saw it. A small campsite not far from the stream. It looked abandoned, with a torn tent, a rusted lantern, and a fire pit filled with ash. There were no signs of people, just a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. I debated whether to investigate, but decided against it. Something about the place felt wrong. I turned back and made my way to my campsite, but the unease followed me. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. I tried to shake off the feeling by keeping busy, gathering more wood and cooking an early dinner. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to close in around me. It was just after dark when I noticed the first sign that I wasn't alone. I was sitting by the fire, lost in thought, when I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on the trail. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached. My first thought was that it was a park ranger or another camper, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It stopped just beyond the light of my fire, and I strained my eyes, trying to see into the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. There was no response, just the sound of the stream and the crackle of the fire. I told myself it was probably an animal and tried to focus on the fire, but my nerves were shot. I didn't sleep much that night, lying in my tent with the knife clutched in my hand. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart race. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. The forest no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a trap. As I started breaking down my tent, I noticed something odd. The ground around my campsite was disturbed, like someone or something had been walking in circles around it. My stomach dropped. The prints were human, large and deep, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a while. I looked around, my heart pounding, but the forest was empty. I finished packing as quickly as I could and started back toward the parking lot. The trail felt different this time, darker and more oppressive. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. About halfway back, I saw it again, the abandoned campsite. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A pile of clothes near the torn tent. They were dirty and torn, but unmistakably human. My gut told me to keep moving, but curiosity got the better of me. As I stepped closer, the smell hit me. A sickly, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. That's when I saw it. A patch of ground near the tent that looked freshly dug. I didn't stay to investigate. Whatever was buried there, I didn't want to know. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing against my back. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, twisting and turning in ways that didn't feel right. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the rusted pickup truck. It was still there, but now the driver's side door was open. I threw my gear into my car and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the woods was a man, watching me. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see the glint of something in his hand. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I got home, I reported what I'd seen to the local authorities. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I searched online for any news about Quiet Pines Campground, but there was nothing. No missing persons, no reports of foul play. It was like it never happened. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why I felt so threatened. All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again. The forest isn't just trees and wildlife. It's a place where you can disappear without a trace, and no one will ever know why. When my grandfather passed away in the summer of 2019, it left a gaping hole in my life. He had always been the one who introduced me to the outdoors. The first time I went fishing, he was there, showing me how to cast a line. The first time I pitched a tent, it was under his watchful eye. Every year we went camping together, just the two of us, deep in the woods near our family cabin in Montana. He called it our spot. A small clearing by a lake surrounded by towering pines. It was where he taught me everything I knew about nature. After his funeral, I found myself wanting to return to that place. I was 27 then, old enough to handle myself in the wilderness, but I hadn't been back there since he started getting sick years before. It felt like going back to our spot might give me some sense of closure. So, a month after the funeral, I packed up my gear, left a note for my mom, and set out alone. The drive took me 6 hours, winding through mountain roads and dirt paths until I reached the edge of the forest. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to the clearing. I parked my truck, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was overgrown, and it was clear no one had been through in a while. I figured it would be nice to be completely alone out there, just me and the memories of my grandfather. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. When I finally reached the clearing, everything was just as I remembered it. The lake was still, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. The old fire pit we'd built together was still there, though it had been taken over by weeds. I dropped my pack and started setting up my tent, feeling a strange mix of sadness and comfort. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. I lit a small fire and sat by it, eating a sandwich I'd packed. The night was quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt like I was honoring my grandfather by being there, keeping our tradition alive in a way. As darkness settled in, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being out here alone. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, hoping sleep would come quickly. But the unease only grew. I kept hearing noises outside, soft but deliberate. Leaves crunching, sticks snapping like footsteps but slower. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The sounds would come and go, circling the campsite. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. At some point, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark, but something was wrong. The fire had gone out, and the air was freezing. I could see my breath in the faint moonlight filtering through the tent. Then I noticed it. The flap of my tent was unzipped. Not all the way, just a few inches, but I knew I had zipped it up before going to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes around the clearing. Nothing moved. I stepped out of the tent, my boots crunching on the frosty ground. The clearing was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I felt exposed, like something was watching me. I scanned the area again, but there was nothing, just the trees and the lake, calm and still. Trying to shake off the fear, I rebuilt the fire and sat by it until dawn. The unease never left, but the daylight made me feel a little safer. I told myself I was just spooked, that being alone in the woods after so long had messed with my head. I decided to stay one more night, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I didn't want to feel like a coward. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked around the lake, took some photos, and even did a little fishing. But as the sun began to set, the unease returned. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to ignore it, focusing on building a bigger fire and cooking a proper meal. That night, the noises started again, but this time, they were closer. The crunch of leaves and snap of twigs were unmistakable, and they were circling my campsite again. I sat by the fire, clutching the knife I always carried, my eyes darting into the darkness. Then, for the first time, I saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the firelight. It was too quick to make out any details, but it was tall and moved on two legs. My blood ran cold. I called out, my voice shaking, but there was no response. The shadow disappeared into the trees, and the noises stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, gripping my knife and staring into the woods. When the sun finally rose, I made the decision to leave. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around my tent. Human footprints. They circled the campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Whoever it was had been watching me all night. The hike back to my truck was the longest 2 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced that whoever or whatever had been out there was following me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and sped off, not looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, part of me wonders if it was just some local messing with me, but another part of me isn't so sure. All I know is that I'll never go back to that clearing again. Whatever peace I hoped to find out there was overshadowed by the feeling that I wasn't alone, and that whoever was out there wanted me to know it.